Nobody really knows what goes through someone's head the moment they decide to disappear, not just physically, but completely. For Zayn al-Rashid, that moment came quietly, almost anticlimactically, on a suffocatingly warm spring night, beneath a sky that refused to offer stars. He was 28, heir to one of the most powerful dynasties in the Middle East, a man born into golden silence. And yet, sitting alone on the stone terrace of the palace, the weight of the crown that wasn't even on his head yet felt unbearable. It wasn't a breakdown. It wasn't even rebellion. It was exhaustion, deep, quiet, and inescapable. All his life had been a perfectly rehearsed performance. How to speak, how to walk, how to breathe without causing disappointment. His father, Sheikh Khalid, had never needed to raise his voice. His silence was law. Zayn didn't remember the last time he'd been touched with affection, or if it had ever happened. His mother had vanished when he was still a boy, left behind only as a ghost of resistance, a memory no one was allowed to talk about. They said she couldn't survive behind the golden veils of the palace, and maybe that's what Zayn feared too, that he'd suffocate in the same velvet cage. That night, he didn't cry. He didn't even flinch. He just sat there staring out at the desert, realizing that for the first time in his life, he was going to choose himself, not out of bravery, out of necessity. The escape wasn't impulsive. It took 2 full days of planning, executed with the meticulous discipline only someone raised inside a royal machine could manage. With the help of an old family friend, a retired military officer who owed his life to Zayn's mother, a new identity was created. Zayn al-Rashid became Saeed Malik, a diplomatic security agent with an untraceable military past, no national affiliation, and just enough mystery to keep people from asking questions. He cut his hair, let a beard grow, lowered his posture, adjusted his accent. He buried the prince and became a ghost. His destination, Tamra, a neighboring kingdom, strategically important and constantly bustling with political visitors, the perfect place to disappear in plain sight. The royal guard there was intentionally multicultural, the system efficient, the hierarchy rigid but fair. Zayn passed the entry tests with ease. His training had been lifelong after all. And though his silence used to be a prison, here it became his shield. No one called him Your Highness. No one expected a marriage to cement alliances. No one cared about his bloodline. For the first time, he could breathe, not completely, but enough to begin feeling the shape of the man he might be, beneath the mask he was finally allowed to remove. And yet, even as he adapted, part of him remained alert, as if the past could knock on the door at any moment. What he didn't know was that his past wouldn't come for him. Instead, his future was already waiting, hidden behind the guarded eyes of the one woman who could see straight through him, long before she even knew his name. Amira of Tamra had never known freedom, not the kind that comes with walking alone, laughing too loud, or simply saying no. She was royalty, yes, the only daughter of the king, the beloved jewel of the realm, but being born into a golden cage doesn't make it less of a prison. Her days were stitched together with protocols and expectations. Ceremonial tea at 10, history lessons at noon, diplomacy at dusk. Since childhood, she had been told she was special, but never asked what she wanted. At 12, she learned not to cross her legs while seated. At 13, she was trained to smile through discomfort. At 14, she understood that love would never be hers to choose. Her purpose was to be the bridge between kingdoms, the image of harmony, the solution to problems that had nothing to do with her heart. And so she obeyed, gracefully, silently. But silence doesn't mean surrender. Behind closed doors, in the quiet of her room, she would sketch, always sketch. Women running barefoot across deserts, men who looked at them with gentleness rather than control. Sometimes she imagined a man, faceless, voiceless, who might see her not as a bargaining chip, but as a woman. It was a fantasy she never dared speak aloud, until the day he appeared. He stood out without trying. That was the first thing she noticed. Among the guards posted at the palace, he was the only one who didn't avert his eyes out of fear, or sneak glances out of desire. He simply stood still, straight, composed, like stone, and yet something about him radiated heat. She watched him from the terrace, from the corridors, from the edge of ceremonies where she wasn't expected to speak. He never smiled, never approached, but he was never indifferent. One afternoon, she overheard 2 guards whispering near the archway. The new one? said. No one knows where he came from. Cold as ice, but sharp. Dangerous, maybe. Amira didn't flinch. She smiled quietly to herself. Dangerous. Or simply, alive? That night she dreamed of him. Not his face, but the feeling of being seen. Not evaluated, not measured. Seen. When she awoke, there was a strange flutter in her chest. Something she hadn't felt since she was a child believing in fairy tales. In the days that followed, her routines shifted slightly. Not enough to raise suspicion, but enough to catch more glimpses of him. She told herself it was coincidence, but every time he passed by, something inside her stirred. Something soft, something dangerous. It happened in an instant. A slip, a misstep, a fall that would have been harmless under other circumstances. But that day, as Amira descended the stone steps of the palace's inner garden, the heel of her sandal caught the edge of a loose tile. She stumbled forward, the world tilting too fast, too suddenly, and then she was caught. Not by the ground, not by her guards or her handmaidens, but by him. His arms were strong, secure, and steady. The fall lasted a heartbeat. The moment lasted forever. Their bodies collided, breath mingled, heartbeats misfired. He steadied her gently, his hands on her waist, then quickly let go. "Majesty," he said, voice low and even, eyes avoiding hers as if they might burn. And then he was gone, retreating like a soldier from a battlefield he never wanted to enter. But Amira stood there, still frozen, still feeling the phantom of his touch on her skin. It wasn't the touch that shook her. It was what she felt in that second of contact. Truth. Not power. Not duty. Just presence. That night, she couldn't sleep. She sat by the window with her sketchbook and wrote beneath a fresh drawing, "The world touches me with fear or possession. He touched me with truth." From that day forward, something inside her began to unravel. Not destructively, but delicately, like a tightly bound ribbon finally being loosened. She started noticing the smallest things about him. The way he stood always 2 steps behind the line of other guards, never breaking formation but always aware. The slight tension in his jaw when she entered a room. The way he never looked directly at her, but she could feel his gaze the moment she turned away. He had become the gravity of her days, invisible, constant, undeniable. And she, though raised to never pursue, began to bend the rules of proximity. She walked slower in the corridors he guarded. She lingered longer in the garden he passed through. It was childish maybe, but it wasn't about games. It was about oxygen. He had become the only source of it. One afternoon, a distant rumble of thunder startled her as she crossed the covered courtyard. Rare weather for Tamra. Out of nowhere, he stepped forward, placing himself between her and the open sky, instinctively shielding her. He said nothing. She said nothing. But her eyes asked, "Why?" And his silence replied, "Because I would rather take the storm than see you flinch. There are things we carry that have no name." For Zane, it was the growing ache in his chest every time she was near. He had trained himself to withstand pain, to tolerate hunger, to bury desire under layers of discipline, but nothing prepared him for her. Amira wasn't just beautiful. She was presence. She moved like someone who had learned to survive in silence, and he saw it, because it was the same silence he carried in himself. After the day he caught her, everything changed. Not visibly. He still stood straight, still reported for duty, still avoided her eyes. But inside, he was unraveling. That night, he sat alone in his quarters, pen in hand, paper shaking beneath his fingers. He wrote what he couldn't say. "She's the kind of woman you never forget, and I'm the kind of man who can't afford to remember." He folded the note, slipped it into the lining of his jacket, and exhaled a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. He didn't want to fall. He couldn't afford to. But falling, he realized, doesn't ask for permission. Amira began to feel like she was walking a tightrope strung between protocol and a question she didn't yet have the courage to ask. She started greeting him with soft nods, testing the distance. Once, she murmured a casual observation about the heat. "It's warmer than usual today, isn't it?" He responded with a short, "Yes, ma'am." Polite, controlled, but not cold. She began to sense it, not rejection, but resistance, as if every word she offered was a key, and he was a lock that had rusted from disuse. Still, she persisted, not out of stubbornness, but necessity. This wasn't infatuation. It was awakening. In every other man's presence, she felt reduced to a title, a body, a duty. But with him, she felt expanded. Not because of what he said, he barely said anything, but because of how he existed beside her. Quiet, constant, real. The more he tried to fade, the more vividly he burned in her mind. One evening, after a formal ceremony, she watched him from across the hall, standing still among the guards, his gaze fixed forward, and for a fleeting second, his eyes flicked to hers. Just once. But it was enough to tell her what she already knew. He was breaking too. Zane tried to pull away, hard. He requested shift changes, avoided assignments that placed him too close to her, rehearsed excuses in his head, but none of it worked, because the palace wasn't what kept him near. It was her, and worse, his body betrayed him every time. Her scent, something soft and clean like desert air after rain, would reach him before her voice did. Her laughter, rare but real, lingered in his mind long after she left a room. He told himself it was temporary, a storm he could outlast if he stayed still long enough. But storms don't wait. They take, and she wasn't a passing wind. She was a force. One afternoon, when a sudden downpour hit the palace, a rare chaotic rain, he found her crossing the courtyard without an umbrella, caught in the surprise of thunder. Without thinking, he moved, stood in front of her, not to protect, to absorb. The thunder cracked again, louder this time. She looked up at him, startled. "Did you think I'd break from the sound?" she whispered, half amused, half amazed. He said nothing, just stood there, a barrier between her and the world, as if to say with silence, "If the world comes for you, it has to go through me first." That night, neither of them slept. Amira paced her room, wrapped in a silk robe, trying to understand what had started to take root inside her. She was no longer just curious. She was tethered. Something about him had carved its way beneath her skin, and she couldn't go back to not feeling it. She reached for her old sketchbook, the one with frayed edges and soft graphite stains from years of hidden drawings. She began to sketch again, first his eyes, then the lines of his jaw, the shadow of his beard. Her hand trembled as she added detail, not out of nervousness, but reverence. Alongside the sketches, she wrote fragmented thoughts. "He doesn't speak, but I hear him louder than anyone. He doesn't reach for me, but I feel him everywhere." Meanwhile, in his room, Zane stared at the ceiling, fists clenched. He didn't write to her. He wrote to the father who would never read his words. "I didn't run because I was weak. I ran because I wanted to breathe. And now, for the first time, I feel alive. And it terrifies me." He folded the page and tucked it away like all the others. A ritual of release, even if no one ever saw it. They were falling, both of them, and the ground was getting closer. It wasn't love at first sight. It was something slower, more dangerous, like a flame crawling toward dry wood. Their paths crossed more frequently, always accidental, always silent. In the corridor near the library, on the stone balcony overlooking the gardens, beside the ceremonial hall just before speeches began. Each time, their eyes would meet briefly, not enough to be noticed, but enough to set the air between them on fire. Amira began testing the boundaries in small ways, standing closer, asking questions she didn't need answers to, letting her hand brush his as she passed by. He never responded, not in words, but the shift in his breathing, the tightness in his jaw, the flicker in his eyes, she noticed it all. She wasn't naive. She knew the danger. She also knew this wasn't some royal fantasy or rebellion. It was recognition. She saw herself in him, not in status but in silence, in the ache of duty, in the craving for something real. Her whole life had been choreographed. But this was chaos, and it was the first thing that made her feel alive. Zane tried to bury himself in routine, as if structure could dull emotion. He trained longer, woke earlier, volunteered for the most grueling assignments, but nothing dulled her presence. She lived in the corners of his thoughts, in the soft echo of her voice, in the way she pressed her fingers to her temple when she was thinking, in the memory of her weight in his arms that day in the garden. He wasn't a man prone to fantasy. He had spent his life erasing hope to make room for discipline. But now, every moment alone became a battle, between the code he swore to uphold and the feeling that was growing in him like a secret trying to claw its way out. Then came the ceremony, a formal religious blessing held in the marble chamber near the palace entrance. Amira knelt for the ritual, head bowed, hands open. Zane stood to the side, part of her ceremonial guard, but when she rose, she stumbled slightly. He caught her again, this time by the arm. It was a second, maybe less, but her skin beneath his hand, the gasp she let out, the way her eyes met his with both shock and familiarity, it cut through him. She whispered, "Thank you." He said nothing, but his hand lingered a fraction too long before releasing her. It was over in a flash, but neither of them would sleep that night. Amira spent that night walking in circles around her room, her silk gown brushing the marble floor as if caught in its own unrest. She wasn't crying. She wasn't even trying to make sense of it anymore. Something had shifted, not in the world, but in her. She had spent so long being composed, being what others needed her to be, that she'd forgotten what it was like to feel. And now, she couldn't stop. That second, his hand on her arm, his eyes not quite meeting hers, replayed over and over in her mind. She pulled out her sketchbook, sat on the floor, and began drawing with a kind of desperate calm. His face this time, his eyes, especially, focused and distant, like a man constantly walking toward the edge of something. And beneath the drawing, she wrote, "The whole world looks at me like a symbol. He looked at me like a person." Her hand paused as she reread it, heart thudding in her chest. She wasn't falling in love. That would be too simple. She was unraveling, being revealed. And the one man who saw her truth was the one man she could never have. Not publicly, not safely. Zane didn't draw. He didn't allow himself the softness of lines and paper. But he did write, not to her, never to her, always to his father, in a ritual he'd begun as a way to survive his own guilt. Letters never sent, thoughts never spoken. That night, after the blessing ceremony, he sat on the cold wooden bench by his window and wrote with urgency, "Father, I followed every rule. I obeyed every silence. But this woman, she makes me feel like I have a soul, and that's what terrifies me the most. Not desire, not scandal, just the terrifying possibility that I am still alive inside." He folded the letter with trembling hands, placed it with the others in the bottom drawer beneath his forged identity papers, and stared into the darkness for hours. Amira was a princess. He was a shadow. She was a promise to a kingdom. He was a man pretending not to exist. And yet, her presence was no longer just a temptation. It was a mirror, showing him what he could be if he chose truth over survival. But the price of that truth, he wasn't sure either of them could afford it. It was inevitable that the illusion of safety would begin to crack. Around the palace, whispers started to circulate. Nothing concrete, just small things, changed shifts, lingering glances, the princess's sudden tendency to appear in corridors she never used before. Zane noticed it first in the way the senior guards began watching him differently, not directly, but with the kind of subtle suspicion only soldiers could master. One afternoon, Malik, one of the longest-serving guards, a man known for his sharp instincts and sharper tongue, approached him in the training yard. "Said Malik," he said casually, the corners of his mouth twitching with something that wasn't quite a smile. "That's your name, right?" Zane nodded, saying nothing. Malik leaned closer. "Strange. You move like someone who's seen too much, or someone who's hiding too well." Then he walked off, leaving behind the unmistakable scent of warning. Zane didn't react, but that night, in his room, he opened the drawer where his real name lived and stared at the paper like it was a ticking bomb. The truth, once just a quiet part of his past, now felt like a threat hanging in the air. And worst of all, if it exploded, it wouldn't just destroy him. Amira wasn't blind to the change either. She began to feel the pressure in ways that weren't spoken aloud. The sudden reappearance of one of her brothers in meetings he had never attended before. The subtle questions from her attendants. The extra pair of eyes trailing her wherever she went. It wasn't confrontation. It was containment. A polite tightening of her world. And yet, instead of fear, it stirred something else in her. Resolve. That night, she walked down to the palace library, unescorted, face hidden beneath a dark veil. She had no plan, just instinct. She knew Zane sometimes hid his notes in the study room's side cabinets. She searched quickly, hands moving with equal parts fear and desperation. And then she found it. A small, unmarked folder tucked beneath a map of the borderlands. Inside, among scraps of old paper, was a partially torn diplomatic document. It bore a seal and a name. Zane al-Rashid. Her breath caught. She stared at the page as if it had burned her fingers. She knew the name. Everyone did. The prince who vanished. The ghost of a throne. The man standing behind her for months wasn't just a soldier. He was the man the world believed had abandoned everything. And now, he was the only person who had ever truly seen her. She didn't confront him immediately. Not because she was afraid of what he'd say, but because she needed time to feel what the truth did inside her. It didn't feel like betrayal. It felt like confirmation. All the fragments, the silence, the strength, the sadness in his eyes, they made sense now. He hadn't lied to deceive her. He'd hidden himself to survive. And somehow, he had still shown her more truth than anyone else in her life ever had. That night, she didn't sleep. She lay on her bed, the document on her lap, and whispered into the stillness, "You lied to the world, but you were the only one honest with me." The next day, she moved through the palace like a ghost, her usual grace replaced with a quiet urgency. At the midday banquet, she sat beside her father, lips sealed, eyes scanning the room until they found him at the far end, uniformed and unreadable. But she saw it, the flicker of panic when their eyes met. He knew, or at least he felt that something was coming. And it was, because she was done being silent. That night, the palace was dressed for a diplomatic celebration. Glittering lights, golden goblets, and the kind of stiff conversation that made Amira want to scream. But she didn't. Instead, she stood up, in the middle of her father's speech, in front of a room filled with ambassadors, allies, and watchful eyes. The silence that followed her movement was immediate, rippling like shock through water. She stepped up the small dais beside the throne and turned to face the hall. Her voice didn't shake. "Today," she said, "I choose to speak for myself, not as a daughter, not as a princess, as a woman." Her father's expression froze. Whispers started to bloom like wildfire. "I love the man you know as Syed Malik," she continued, her eyes never leaving Zayn's. "But that is not his name. His name is Zayn al-Rashid, and I don't care who he was born to be. I care who he's become." Gasps filled the room. Her brothers moved instinctively, but she held her ground. And from the back, Zayn walked forward, slowly, deliberately, the mask falling with every step. "Yes," he said, voice steady. "I am Zayn al-Rashid. I gave up a throne to find myself, and I found her." In that moment, everything that had been unspeakable was finally said, and the world, for a breathless second, didn't know what to do. The air in the throne room turned dense, almost electric, like the calm before a storm no one could predict. Zayn stood before the assembled royalty, diplomats and guards, not as a soldier, not even as a prince, but as a man who had run from power and found something even more terrifying, love that demanded truth. He looked at the king, at the men who had once wielded silence as power, and then back at Amira. "I left my title behind, not because I was weak," he said, his voice echoing through the stillness, "but because I refused to become a king without a soul. I found that soul in her." A murmur spread across the room like thunder rolling low to the ground, but no one moved. Not yet. Amira stepped down from the dais and walked toward him. No one tried to stop her, and when she reached him, he held out his hand, not demanding, not dramatic, just there. She took it. The gesture said everything. Not a rebellion, a choice. One that defied protocol, threatened alliances, and rewrote the very roles they had been born to play. The king didn't speak. He only stared. At them. At what they had become. At what they had risked. And for the first time in years, Zayn saw something unfamiliar in the man's eyes. Not anger, not disappointment, just recognition. The rest of the evening passed like a dream none of them could fully wake from. The guests dispersed in stunned silence, unsure whether they had witnessed a scandal or a beginning. The king made no announcement. The brothers, despite their tension, didn't intervene. And the palace, normally a maze of whispers, fell quiet. Amira and Zayn didn't speak much that night. They didn't have to. The weight of everything unsaid had already been lifted. Later, as the halls darkened and the world outside resumed its rhythms, they found themselves alone in the palace garden, beneath the low light of lanterns swaying in the breeze. She looked at him, truly looked, and whispered, "Are you afraid?" He nodded just once. "Yes, but not of them." She stepped closer, her hand brushing his. "Then what?" His answer came low, barely audible. Of you. Of this. Because it's the only thing I can't walk away from." She didn't kiss him. Not yet. Instead, she pressed her forehead against his, eyes closed, heart open. "Then don't," she said. "Stay. Not as a prince. Not as a guard. Just as you." That night, no vows were made, no promises sealed. But for the first time, both of them felt free. Not because they'd escaped the world's expectations, but because they'd chosen to stop escaping themselves. In the days that followed, the palace didn't erupt like everyone had expected. There were no public declarations, no formal exiles, just a silence that stretched longer than usual, a political pause, deliberate and measured. But inside the walls, everything had shifted. Zayn's presence was no longer invisible. The guards who used to nod with quiet respect now looked at him with unease, some even with thinly veiled hostility. Amira's brothers kept their distance, but their eyes never did. And yet, amidst the tension, something beautiful began to root itself in the spaces where fear had once lived. Zayn and Amira, though watched more closely than ever, began carving out small pockets of truth. Morning walks through the eastern corridors, shared glances during council meetings, the occasional brush of hands under long sleeves. They never spoke of the future. It felt too fragile to name. But in those stolen moments, they lived as if they already had one. He became her shadow, not because he was ordered to, but because that's where he wanted to be. And she, who had once mastered the art of masking emotion, started to glow in a way that couldn't be hidden. Love, even when secret, has a way of making itself seen. But love is never safe, not in palaces, not when names carry weight heavier than hearts can bear. The walls began to whisper again, louder this time. One evening, after Zayn had finished weapons training in the lower yard, Malik approached him with that same unsettling calm. "I hear the princess sleeps better these days," he said, flicking imaginary dust from his sleeve. Strange how some guards can have such a calming effect. Zayn didn't answer, didn't blink, but inside, he knew. They were watching, waiting, and when power feels threatened, it doesn't ask questions, it eliminates risk. That night, he returned to his room, closed the door, and sat in the dark. The silence wasn't peaceful anymore. It was a warning. He pulled out a piece of paper and began to write. Not to Amira, not to his father, but to himself. "I tried to hide. I became a ghost, but ghosts still cast shadows, and mine has finally caught up with me." He folded the letter, placed it beneath his uniform, and leaned back against the wall, eyes wide open. Sleep wouldn't come, because even in the dark, the truth was knocking. Amira felt it too, the change in energy, the sharpness in the air. Her world, once stifling but predictable, now felt like a deck of cards being shuffled in slow motion, as if everyone was waiting for the wrong one to fall. She tried to act normal. She went to meetings, smiled during ceremonial dinners, walked the palace halls with practiced grace. But Zayn was slipping away. Not physically. He was still there, stationed near her, guarding her movements. But emotionally, he was retreating. The quiet between them had grown louder, heavier. One afternoon, unable to take it any longer, she cornered him in the narrow corridor near the old library wing, a place rarely used and never guarded. Veiled, disguised, heart racing. "You're avoiding me?" she said plainly, her voice low but firm. He tried to respond with a blank expression, but she saw it, the pain behind the mask. "What's happening?" she asked. He shook his head. "It's not safe," he finally whispered. "Not for you. Not anymore." She stepped closer, her voice breaking just slightly. "You don't get to decide that alone. I didn't find myself just to lose you." His jaw clenched. "If I stay, I could destroy everything." She stared at him for a long time. "And if you leave, you'll destroy me." That night, she did something she hadn't done in years. She returned to her mother's old chamber. The room had been locked since her disappearance, left untouched like a wound the palace couldn't heal. But she had memorized where the spare key was hidden. Inside, everything was dust and memory, the scent of jasmine still faint on the curtains, the mirror still holding a vague reflection of a woman who had once dared to choose freedom. Amira sat on the edge of the bed and opened her sketchbook. This time, she didn't draw Zayn. She drew herself, not as a princess, not as a bride, but as a woman standing on the edge of a cliff, arms open, ready to fall. Beneath the drawing, she wrote, I was never meant to be a symbol. I was born to feel. She closed the book, pressed it to her chest, and breathed in the silence her mother had left behind. It wasn't weakness. It was a path. And maybe it was time she followed it, even if it meant breaking every rule she had ever been taught. Because love that is hidden too long eventually demands a light. And she was done living in the dark. Zane didn't sleep that night. He sat by the window of his modest quarters, watching the moon shift across the desert sky like a silent messenger of things he couldn't say aloud. Every breath he took felt like a countdown. They knew, or at least they suspected. And soon, silence wouldn't protect her. Not anymore. He thought of the document she must have found by now. The half-ripped seal, the name that carried a kingdom's weight. He had never wanted her to discover him like that. Not as a prince, not as a symbol of anything, just as a man. A man trying to live without performing. A man trying to love without destroying. As the night deepened, he wrote one last letter. This one he didn't address to anyone. They will come for me. And when they do, I'll go. But I won't let them touch her. He folded the note with a kind of finality that scared even him. As dawn approached, he packed a single bag, removed his identification badge, and left it on the desk. He had made his choice, and it was hers. If leaving meant she could be safe, then he would vanish all over again. Not as a prince, not as a ghost, but as a man who had finally understood what love meant. But Amira wasn't going to let him disappear again. Not without a fight. That morning, when she heard the soft knock from one of her trusted attendants, she knew. The bed hadn't been slept in. The guard post was empty. Said Malik was gone. She didn't scream, didn't panic. She simply moved. Veiled in dark silk, she made her way through the palace, slipping past the royal guards with the practiced ease of someone who'd learned long ago how to move unseen in a place that claimed to own her. She reached the stables just in time. His horse was already saddled. He stood by it, one hand on the reins, the other clenched in a fist. She didn't call out. She just walked up behind him, heart thundering, and said, "You're really going to leave me like this?" Zane turned slowly, eyes heavy with something deeper than guilt, a sorrow carved by love. "If I stay, they'll ruin you to punish me." Amira stepped closer, voice steady. "Then let them try. But I won't live another day pretending this didn't happen. I found you, Zane, and I'm not letting go." For a moment, nothing moved. Then he dropped the reins. She reached for his hand, and together, without a map, without a crown, without a plan, they rode into the horizon, where rules didn't matter, and love could finally speak its name. They didn't run far, just far enough to breathe. A few hours away, nestled between the curves of the desert hills, stood the old ruins of Al-Ruzar, a forgotten temple swallowed by time and sand, a place Amira had once mentioned in passing, her voice wistful, her eyes distant. Zane remembered, and somehow she knew he would. When they arrived, the air was still, the stones warm from the sun, the silence almost sacred. They dismounted without speaking. Amira stepped through the fallen archways with a strange calm, barefoot now, her veil gone, her hair loose and dancing in the dry breeze. Zane followed, unsure of what to say, unsure of what came next, only sure that he was exactly where he needed to be. She turned to him between two broken pillars and said, "This is the only place I've ever felt free." He swallowed hard. "Then let's not leave." She didn't ask for certainty. He didn't offer promises. But in that temple, with no witnesses, no scripts, no shadows, they stood face to face, and the world finally felt quiet. And when he kissed her, it wasn't dramatic. It was inevitable, like silence giving way to sound, like truth being touched for the first time. It was a kiss that didn't ask for permission, a kiss that belonged not to royalty or rebellion, but to two people who had survived themselves just enough to find each other. Zane's hands trembled as they cupped her face, not from fear, but from the awe of being allowed to hold something so real. Amira melted into him, not as a symbol, not as someone escaping a crown, but as a woman who had spent a lifetime waiting to be touched like she wasn't breakable. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the stone floor as their bodies pressed closer, breaths mingling, hearts racing in sync. His mouth moved to her neck, slow, reverent. Her fingers tangled in his shirt, pulling him closer, anchoring herself in the one place that felt like home. Neither spoke. There was no need. In that moment, every unspoken thought, every stolen glance, Every trembling confession lived in the space between their skin. And when he finally whispered against her lips, "You are my only truth," she replied without hesitation, "Then let's build a life where we don't have to hide it." They stayed until the stars came out, not hiding, not fleeing, just being, for the first time, fully, together. They returned before dawn, quietly, no fanfare, no defiance, just two souls who had nothing left to pretend. Amira slipped through the palace's back entrance, her veil lowered again, her heartbeat steady in a way it had never been. Zayn entered through the guard's corridor, his uniform back in place, his posture precise. But everything had changed. The palace noticed, not because of what they said, but because of what they no longer could hide. She smiled differently now. He stood taller, and that terrified the people who lived in shadows of tradition. Rumors thickened. Her brothers grew restless. Malik watched from a distance like a hawk circling wounded prey. One afternoon, Zayn was summoned to the training yard by the commander. The orders were vague, the conversation even more so. But the meaning was clear. "You've been seen." Later that evening, Amira found him sitting alone by the courtyard fountain. She didn't ask questions. She just sat beside him and placed her hand over his. "If they make you leave," she said softly, "I'll go with you." He didn't answer right away, then finally whispered, "They won't have to. They're planning to break us from the inside." And for the first time, she truly understood what love costs in a palace that survives on silence. The final blow came not in the form of a direct command, but a carefully orchestrated performance. A royal banquet was scheduled, framed as a celebration of unity and diplomatic strength. But Amira knew. She saw the extra guards stationed by her wing, the way her father avoided her gaze, the way Malik stood just a little too close. She also knew Zayn's name had been discovered, not by accident, but by design. Someone had leaked the truth, and not to punish him, but to corner her. At the height of the evening, when the wine was full and the speeches began, the king raised his goblet. "To alliances forged by legacy," he said, "and to the engagement of Princess Amira to Prince Farid of Karat." The room applauded. She didn't. Zayn, standing at his post behind the hall's far column, didn't move, didn't blink. But inside, something broke that wouldn't mend again. Amira turned her head slightly. Their eyes met across the gilded expanse. And that was it. The final confirmation. The crown would rather marry her off to a stranger than face the truth of the man she had chosen. That night, she didn't cry. She didn't scream. She simply stared out her window, the palace lights shimmering like lies in the distance, and whispered to herself, "I may have been born a princess, but I won't die someone else's pawn." The following morning, before the sun had fully risen, Amira was gone. Her room untouched, her crown left behind on the vanity like an accusation. The silk gown chosen for the engagement announcement lay folded across her bed. No letter, no warning, just absence, and a single open window. Panic spread through the palace like wildfire. The king summoned his advisors. Her brothers launched searches under the guise of security drills. But Zayn didn't wait for orders. He already knew. Her absence wasn't random. It was sacred. He rode out alone, straight toward the only place that ever made sense to her. Al-Ruzar, the ruined temple, their quiet sanctuary carved from memory and sand. When he arrived, heart pounding, he found her sitting between the cracked columns, barefoot again, hair unbound, her face turned to the sky as if waiting for a sign. She didn't turn when he approached. "I knew you'd come," she said, not as a question, but as a certainty. He knelt beside her, unsure if he should speak, unsure what could possibly be said now. "You left everything," he whispered. "No," she corrected, eyes finally meeting his. "I took back what was mine." They stayed at the temple for hours, wrapped in silence and sun, knowing the moment would eventually end, but refusing to let it be stolen. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy. "They'll come for us." She nodded. "Let them." He reached for her hand, threading his fingers through hers. "Are you ready for what that means?" Her eyes didn't waver. "I was never ready to live a lie. That's what I'm leaving behind, not a crown." And in that space, with only the wind to witness it, they made a vow, not in words, not in ritual, but in breath and skin and presence. A quiet promise to stop running from themselves. When they returned to the palace, They weren't met with guards or shouts, just the inevitable stillness of a kingdom pretending nothing had happened. But everything had. Zayn no longer stood behind her. He walked beside her, and she, no longer a princess bound by duty, was now a woman who had chosen her truth, and the man who reflected it back to her. In a world where love is silenced, theirs had found a voice, and it would never be quiet again.